All right, today we're going to be looking at both the diagrams for and some of the underlying factors of monopoly. Monopoly is the complete opposite of perfect competition. Perfect competition is hundreds of sellers, perfectly homogeneous products, perfect information, and free barriers to entry and exit. Monopoly is just one seller, completely unique, massive barriers to entry, and maybe not a whole lot of information. First thing to keep in mind about a monopolist is because it's a unique product, it's differentiated from everything else, the demand curve is downward sloping. Not like perfectly competitive markets where for a firm the demand curve is perfectly elastic. So because of that, marginal revenue does not equal demand. And marginal revenue essentially splits demand. The way to think about that is if you sell one product for $10, your marginal revenue is 10. The next product you sell, if you have to lower the price, you don't get to charge $10 and $9, you have to charge the two people $9. It'd be a total revenue of 18, so for the next one it'd be marginal revenue of 18. You follow on down the list. Marginal revenue goes below zero, it equals zero at a certain point, and then it will actually become a negative number. This helps us understand why earlier in the year we talked about a straight line demand curve. The midpoint is unitarily elastic. That is when marginal revenue is zero because total revenue doesn't change. Right, to the left of the midpoint, it is elastic. As price falls, total revenue goes up. Marginal revenue is positive. To the right is an inelastic part of the demand curve. Right, as price falls, total revenue goes down. That's by definition. And as we see over here, as price falls, marginal revenue is negative. Total revenue falls. Right. Keep this particular diagram in mind. And we're looking at what an actual monopolist diagram looks like. Before we get there, a reminder, monopoly, one seller, unique product, usually gigantic, but there are certainly barriers to entry. But like all other firms, regardless of whether they're perfectly competitive, regardless of whether they're an oligopoly, a monopoly, or monopolistically competitive, they will set output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This is the profit maximization point. It is the optimal output point. Some barriers that may exist to create a monopoly: patents, trademarks, copyrights. Governments do those to sort of spur on innovation. A company might control supply. If you own all of the diamonds in the world because you found them in your backyard, you're probably a monopoly. You might have a massive economies of scale advantage. If you get so big, you drive average cost down, no one else might be able to compete with you. Government might legislate a natural monopoly. I've used an example in class, I think with both classes. It wouldn't make sense to have 5 or 6 or 7 competing gas companies run pipes to your house. It'd mess up all of our yards. It wouldn't make sense. So just because one gas pipe coming makes sense, the government tries to legislate this natural monopoly. It might be truly unique. You might create brand loyalty, so there may not be any other products to compete with. And lastly, you may, because you have an advantage, compete and have control over outlets and essentially do a price war worry. In other words, you may tell a smaller competitor, if you enter the industry, we're going to cut prices until you're out of business. These are generally considered illegal, but that's one way you may create barriers to entry. What does this all look like? Right? What this all looks like for a monopoly is here. Lots of lines, don't get confused. First, we start with a downward sloping demand curve that is no different than any other demand curve that we've drawn. It's the demand curve for whatever product this monopolist is selling. Then if you go back to the other particular diagram we looked at, marginal revenue cuts that. Okay? Because you can't sell unless you can perfectly price discriminate. That's something completely different. You can't sell 1 for here, 2 for there, etc. because once a price is set, that's set for everybody. Marginal revenue cuts this way. This firm has a marginal cost curve, and just like every firm does, and just like every firm, okay, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that's quantity. We go straight up from quantity. Where it hits demand and go over, that's the price people are willing and able to pay. So that's how we determine price. As this is happening, we don't know whether or not this firm is earning any profits or losses, or if they are breaking even. Essentially, they could earn 0 economic profits. In this case, the way I have drawn the average total cost curve, okay, remember as it comes down, this should be at the minimum. It's not exactly drawn correctly, but marginal cost cuts through average total cost, just like in any diagram at its lowest point. In this case, if this is the way it's drawn, as you see at this quantity, This right here, okay, I've labeled it C, right, is the average cost at that quantity. At point B, as we come across, that's the average revenue. On average, that's the price that you get. The difference, okay, and over this area from A to B to C to D are your economic profits. That can be earned in the short and the long run. It can because there are massive barriers to entry. Other firms are not going to enter to take away the economic profits the way they would in a perfectly competitive industry. And then one quick thing to understand, if we allow the market to operate, we would be at point E, equilibrium. The marginal cost per single firm is essentially their supply curve. So where supply meets demand, or in this case where marginal cost equals demand, that should be where the price is set. Because it's not, we're taking away some community surplus. The community surplus we're taking away is represented by this triangle here from B to F to E. Right? The utility gained, okay, in that area, if we were allocatively efficient, is gone. Because of that, oftentimes it's one of the reasons we say we don't like monopolies. Thank you for listening, and remember, keep your opportunity costs high and your expectations low.